were going to think about going back to that, and then COVID hit. All right, here we go. All right, good evening, everyone. I'd like to convene the regular planning board meeting of November 10th, 2020. We'll start with roll call. And we'll start with Mr. Sear to my right, and we'll go really slowly, and we'll finish with
Evan Sear.
Dan Carroll.
Dana Staples.
Riley Bergeron.
Darren Finnegan.
I'm Chairman Matt Duval. Our first item for the night, item number 2, is the approval of the minutes for the October 13th meeting. Any comments on the minutes?
I do have an edit under number 6, election of officer. It indicates after a vote of 7-0, the motion carried. I did abstain from that vote, so it would be 6-0-1.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on the minutes?
Make a motion to approve the minutes as amended.
Second.
All in favor? Okay. Thank you. Which brings us to our first major item in the evening, the site plan special exception, proposed minor subdivision of the parcel at 101 Merrill Road, PID 186-015, Future Guard Holdings, LLC, to create 3 industrial parcels pursuant to Chapter 60, Article 16, Division 4, subdivision of the City of Auburn ordinances. Start with staff report.
Future Guard is back with another proposal for the creation of 3 industrial parcels on the existing property. The factory building and other improvements will remain on the 16.8 acre parcel while still meeting all of the dimensional and landscaping requirements that the board has approved. And the remaining portion of the land will be split into a 6.3 acre parcel and a 2.4 acre parcel on either side of the existing Future Guard building. The proposed lots meet all of the dimensional requirements that are required for the industrial district. And if they weren't triggering a subdivision, you wouldn't really be reviewing this type of proposal. But because they are creating a subdivision, that's why it's coming before the planning board. One item that we pointed out in the staff report that we wanted to make the planning board aware of is that once the planning board approves lots in an industrial subdivision, any permitted use that's subject to special exception review by the planning board is no longer required to be reviewed by the planning board. So planning staff will still review them and department heads, but it will only go before the planning board if staff feels that the improvements need further review for the common site elements such as traffic, drainage, infrastructure improvements, water, sewer, fire protection, those sorts of things. So the planning board would no longer be reviewing the additions to the Future Guard site. And currently there aren't any plans for the 2 additional lots, but any permitted or special exception use could be allowed provided they meet all of the requirements of the district and it's approved by staff. The only comment we got from department heads was the police department. They just want to take a close look at the driveway openings and try to minimize them when the lots are developed. So this is something that staff would work with them through the development review process. So with that, we really think it's great what they've been able to do out at the Future Guard site. So we support the planning board approving the lot splits.
Thank you. Any questions from the board for staff?
Yeah, I have one. So reading the general requirements, this is really just more of me educating myself about this approving a subdivision and not so much about this particular subdivision. But there was a section 2, preservation of natural and historic features, preservation of existing trees and vegetation. I was kind of wondering, you know, in an industrial subdivision, how do you preserve existing trees? How does that even work?
Yeah, so what's interesting is the industrial district itself has some pretty stringent landscaping requirements. They're not really typical of what you'd see in an industrial district. It requires a pretty substantial buffer around the parking areas and around the buildings. And they've provided that for the existing Future Guard building, and any improvements that they make on those 2 lots would have to also meet those requirements. So certainly during the subdivision review process, it's something that you could consider, but I think that it's covered in the ordinance in that we would review it as staff and make sure those requirements are adhered to, so.
Thanks.
So that's actually, sort of touches on a question I have, and I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The creation of the subdivision, the lot that has the Future Guard building on it now, will still be compliant?
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yep, they've situated the lot so that it still meets the landscaping requirements and the dimensional requirements for the industrial district.
Okay, great. And does that include the stormwater?
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. Any other questions for staff on this one? No? Okay, we'd like to give the applicant an opportunity to speak.
Good evening. My name is Mike Gatto. I really don't have anything more to add. I can answer any questions. This is a simple subdivision as staff has appointed. It's going to allow us the flexibility of financing lots and improvements in the future differently. So it's important to the plan for us to keep that project and property moving forward with additional buildings and stuff out there. So. Other than that, I'll answer any questions that this board might have of me.
Great, thank you, Mr. Gatto. Any questions for the applicant? Nope. Hearing none, thank you. So at this point, we will move to the public comment.
I make a motion to open the public input section of the hearing.
Thank you.
Second?
Second, all in favor? Thank you. At this time, I'd like to ask any member of the public that wishes to speak about this issue to come forward.
I'll go confirm nobody's in the other room.
Thank
I
you.
don't think there is, but I'll check.
Thank you.
Point of order. We need to address the issue of voting rights for this particular meeting.
Need to, what?
The issue of membership, associate membership versus full membership.
Thank you. Anyone in the other? No? Okay. Seeing no members of the public, do I have a motion to close public comment?
So moved.
Second?
All those in favor? Okay, as Mr. Sear has kindly pointed out, I neglected, because of the way arrivals happen, to suggest that since we are short of regular members at this meeting, that our associate member, Mr. Bergeron, will participate as a full member. He will be able to make motions and vote. Okay, so public comment is closed. Discussion on this item from the board. Anyone have any issues they want to bring up? Okay, hearing none, I will be looking for a motion.
I make a motion to approve the proposed minor subdivision for the creation of 3 industrial parcels located at 101 Merrow Road, parcel ID 186-015, in the industrial zoning district.
Thank you. Does anyone want to second that?
Second.
Second that.
Any discussion? No? Okay, all in favor? Thank you. Great. Next item on the agenda is the discussion about the zoning ordinance update to form-based code. The issue is to expand the T 4.2 traditional downtown neighborhood to the downtown enterprise district in the area adjacent to the Academy, Elm, Maple, Pleasant, Hyde, Drummond, and a portion of Spring Streets, and the multifamily urban district in the Laurel Avenue and Newbury Street neighborhood. Staff?
Yes, so good evening. This item was sent to you by the City Council. They were presented these options, and they're looking for a recommendation about whether you concur that this expansion should happen. I would like to start out by pointing out that in the staff memo, there is a couple of sentences there talking about the uses, which is not entirely accurate, so let me make it clear. So if you go to the staff recommendations under the form-based code expansion, it says other considerations. Generally, the change recommend little impact on allowed uses, which is true, but the expanded uses in the downtown enterprise zone would continue. That's also true, but right now, they would be permitted uses, and if you changed it to form-based code, they would become special exception uses. In the multifamily urban zone, which is the Laurel, Newbury Street neighborhood, professional offices right now are special exception uses, and they would continue to be under form-based code, so very little would change in the multifamily. But I want to make that clear. It makes it seem like nothing's going to change in the downtown enterprise, and there is a slight change. It will move professional offices and medical offices from permitted uses in that zone to special exception uses. The biggest change to moving to form-based code is that in the multifamily urban area, Newbury Street, Laurel Avenue, the setback is 25 feet from the street for the properties in those neighborhoods. Most of the homes now are non-conforming because of that standard. Most of them are closer to the street than that. Under the form-based code, the setback would be 5 feet. So there would be residents in those neighborhoods now that could either add porches or stoops onto the front of their homes, which they are not permitted to do right now. Other than that, this is going to be sort of a phased exploration for you. This is the first phase. We're limiting the number of areas that we're considering tonight, basically because of COVID, and we didn't want to have our original plan would be to have this happen up off the Turner Street neighborhood and down in New Auburn in the multifamily urban, and there was going to be about 2,000 parcels affected. So we didn't want to have all those people feel that they might have to come down here if there was an issue with all our limitations. So you're going to see this in December and then probably again in January for New Auburn and up on the Turner Street area on that side of the city. Other than that, there are not many changes to the uses. Form-based code, as you're probably all aware, just has to do with basically the location of the building on the site and how it fits into the neighborhood overall versus traditional zoning, which is all about uses. So, but there aren't many changes in the uses in either one of these neighborhoods other than the one I mentioned in the downtown enterprise zone. And I'll take any questions. I have another presentation if you want to go through it. I went around into these neighborhoods and I took pictures of the streets so you can see that the houses are up on the street and that they look a certain way, which seems to be in conformance with the form-based code requirements. I can do that if you would like to take the time. Would you like me to do that?
So I would think that would be nice to see. Thank you.
Yep.
We're going to switch. Just a minute. Looks like we're going to go into the comp plan. New site here. So this was the presentation that we gave, that I gave to City Council in October. I'll just go through these quick characteristics of this zone. It's supposed to have more public and private realm interaction, meaning that the stoops and the porches are right up on the sidewalk, so as your neighbors walk by, you can say hello. That kind of interaction is what we're looking at there. Front-facing details, making sure the front of the building is facing the street. Small front yards, bay windows, neighborhood-scaled storefronts, fences, street trees, and moderate densities. These are kind of examples of what can fit into this particular zone, or what the ideal would look like. See, small storefronts, things like that. This will be for next time. This will be New Auburn. You can look at that when we get to New Auburn. This is the Laurel Street neighborhood, so you'll see as I go through here, these are marking where these properties are, and I can make the pictures kind of larger so that you can see. So you see the fences are up on the sidewalk or the public realm. There are street trees. The homes are fairly close to the street. Oops, I went too far. Sorry about that. Not New Auburn. There we go. This is another example. You can see the homes are close to the street, the front doors. These would all continue to be permitted uses in these neighborhoods. When we get to New Auburn, there are buildings that are 4 stories high when you get to the New Auburn project, which are non-conforming now, and they'll continue to be non-conforming. There are not any buildings I can't think of in these 2 neighborhoods that we will be making non-conforming. We'll actually be making most of the buildings more conforming by putting them into form-based code because of the setback requirements. Downtown Enterprise Zone is the same way. So you can see the homes are right up on the sidewalk. Same here, street trees. The homes are close to the sidewalk. This here is obviously right on the sidewalk. And in this zone, it's supposed to be a 10-foot setback, not 25 feet, but you can see these are already, they're already non-conforming even with 10 feet. So we think this fits the basic idea for the form-based code in the traditional downtown neighborhood zone, but I'll leave that to you to see if you agree.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the board for staff?
So maybe just a point of order. There were 2 planning board actions items here listed. Are we just talking about the first one at this point, or do you want to talk about both at the same time?
Oh, yeah. Yes, you are right. There is another point there. I can go through that if you would like me to go through that right now. Okay. So the proposal would be with the form-based code districts to give the planning board flexibility to apply the neighboring district's zoning requirements to a property that's on the other side of the line. So if we had a property here, if I'm using this map, this parcel here, it's on the corner. If it was going to be advantageous or the board thought it was in the best interest of the project, you would be allowed to apply the form-based code area that would be this expanded yellow area here now. You would be able to apply that 1 parcel or maybe 2 parcels or whatever you think is appropriate over. So you could expand that line over for a particular development if you thought that it fit the neighborhood and it didn't make much of a difference. The idea for that is that these lines are drawn on a map in some places just so they can have a line at some point. And sometimes there isn't really a difference from one house or one building to the next one over, but we had to put a line somewhere. So this would just give flexibility for you to determine whether it would be appropriate to extend that maybe 1 more parcel if it was going to work out for a development or if it was in the best interest of the city for whatever reason. So that's sort of that part. That's the idea with the flexibility, or as I was calling it earlier, Eric didn't like, is the blurry line zone. He didn't like that term. But, so that's what that proposal is all about.
Thank you. Questions for staff on this issue?
So with regard to the second request from City Council for us to look at, are you talking about looking at non-form-based zoned areas adjacent to areas that are zoned form-based, or were they talking about any zone adjacent to any other type of zone?
We were talking about just applying it to the form-based code zones at this time. So it would have to be from one form-based code zone into the next form-based code zone.
To the next form-based code zone.
Yeah, so it would have to be a
not extend
neighboring
out-
form-based code zone in order to explain it. I think there would be some complications to trying to apply form-based code. They just don't line up very well to traditional zoning, you know, the way they work is completely different, so it would be more complicated activity, I think, to try to determine whether that was appropriate to move from a form-based code into a traditional zoning.
And so is council looking for us at this point just to identify whether that's something we'd be interested in pursuing or not? Or are they asking that we, if we are interested in pursuing it, that we develop the language?
I think if you were interested in developing it, they would be looking for language to take back to council for them to adopt.
So I have a question about that part two, actually. If, and maybe this is for us to decide, given what you just said, but if that zone application happened, does that effectively move the boundary of the zone?
I'm not sure exactly how that would work. I don't know if it would permanently move that zone, or if it would just be something that would be a deliberative process where you would say, we're going to apply the criteria of this zone to this property. I don't know if we'd consider it like an overlay, or if we would actually move the zone line. I'm not sure. Do you have any ideas, Megan?
I wouldn't think that we would move the zone line, especially if you're considering it to be 2 parcels out, because then we'd be getting into spot zoning on specific parcels. So it's something we could certainly look into. If it's just a parcel that's neighboring an existing zoning district, then that's basically what you do already, like with Petro's, for example, the hardware store, where we moved the line for the residential district and the commercial district. But if it's 2 parcels over, then it becomes a little tricky because you're not lining up the zoning districts, if that makes sense. So it's something that we'll have to think through how we want to make that work.
Yeah, I guess my question was, if we take that building that Justin was pointing out, and we apply T 4.2 to that building, does the one behind it now become eligible to be adjacent? Right?
Right. So correct, if you move the boundary, every time you move it, there's another adjacent property, and it's just going to keep going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah.
And I guess as we're discussing it, my question for staff would be, if we were to do this without moving the boundary and simply say that we're going to apply the standards from one zone to another, what would be the implications for creating a property that is now no longer conforming? Because how would it be, I guess I'd want to hear more about that from staff. Like, what is the vision for being able to apply the requirements from one zone onto a property in a different zone while still allowing that second property to not become non-conforming in the zone that it exists?
Right. It's a good question. It's almost like a special exception on that parcel that the planning board would have to look at, or you would just have to change the zoning district for that one parcel, but then, like you said, trying to document that change happened on that one parcel and identifying what parcels are next to it that would no longer be eligible would be a tricky thing to do. But I understand why it's a suggestion, just because if someone could do something next door to the form-based code, why couldn't they do it on the lots next to it? But
So, and I guess the follow-up question would be, what would be the advantage of a policy or system like this over simply asking someone to seek a zone change?
it would be an easier process for sure. They wouldn't have to go back before the city council if it's something that the planning board can approve. They wouldn't have to get the petition signed and go through the process of changing the zoning district. So it would make it simpler for them to do that.
Would it part of the reason that process seems onerous to people is because it requires outreach to neighbors. I mean, it makes it a really public process,
Right.
right? Is there any thought on how to maintain that sort of public input piece?
Planning board review. It would still come before planning board, almost, like I said, like a special exception, just for the lots that would be adjacent to that new proposed form-based code. That would be the way that I would recommend.
And they would receive notice the way
Correct,
when a
yep.
butter would normally
Everyone
receive
within
notice.
500 feet would receive notice. So it would be the typical public process like you would do for a zoning change. It just wouldn't have the city council component. But in terms of, staff tracking that a special exception was granted on that parcel, or that the zoning line was, we couldn't change the zoning line without going before city council, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. So it would have to be a special exception.
Is there anything in state statute that requires that the city council be the final adjudicatory body with regard to change of land zoning?
I'm fairly certain, yes, that's consistent across almost every community in Maine, so I'm fairly certain of that, but I can definitely double check.
So I guess if we were to move forward, another question I have from staff is I'd really want to hear how this would dovetail with whatever that state statute is. Because it sounds like we're shifting adjudicatory authority to the planning board. But I want to make sure if we did something like that, that we're not running afoul of state statute and giving someone standing to reverse a decision that's made.
I think I agree with that, Mr. Sear, and I would also sort of expand that request to say, all right, if this was made reality, what would the process be? Because as we've suggested, if you're changing the zone, then that becomes something that staff has to do every time this sort of decision is made at the whim of the planning board. And if not, then you're tracking special exceptions on a property-by-property basis, which seems, if the process that Mr. Carroll was talking about were to occur over a number of years, over a number of properties, could get to be tricky and onerous. So thinking through that process, I think, would really be helpful.
So I kind of wonder, how often would this, I don't know, if this was enacted several years ago, how often do you think you would have actually used it? Is this something that comes to you often?
We hear all the time from people, my neighbor across the street has, this, why can't I do this on my property? So it's certainly, when it comes to uses, it's definitely something that we hear happen a lot. So if they were allowed to have a use that's allowed in a form-based code across the street, then it would definitely, it could explode into a lot of inquiries coming before the board.
To
I could
me,
see that.
when I first saw this, and it's even stated in there, 186 Main Street is, that came to council a couple years ago for this same purpose, to change the zoning on it. So I just wonder, is this, to me, it just seems like you're leapfrogging the process. It's, not that it's like a bad thing, but it just seems like I would worry about what Mr. Sears said as far as giving the planning board the authority to change a zone, effectively, like going over the council in that regard.
And the planning board could certainly identify components of the adjacent parcels that could be a special exception, but you would have to apply that to the entire zoning district. You couldn't just identify the parcels along that line and say, you can do this here. You'd have to do that for the entire zoning district. So if it's multifamily urban that abuts the form-based code, the entire multifamily urban would have to be included. So, because otherwise you're spot zoning, which is, you can't do, so.
So is one of the planning board actions could be potentially to recommend that 186 Main Street is changed to downtown traditional, down, what is it, city center? That's the one. So is that something that we would consider as a separate thing, or is that?
It is, that was one, that parcel you mentioned, the reason that's mentioned is because the council brought up, this idea sort of was brought to the council as a response to their desire to look at that parcel again on Main Street. So this was a way to sort of do that on not just a one-off sort of fix for that parcel, but to give the planning board that same flexibility to do in other like scenarios. That's where the thing came forward. I would think that if you were going to recommend that zone be changed, that we probably have to have a separate public hearing for that, so that those people would be aware that you're trying to change that zone.
So it kind of sounds like we have a lot of things that we're being asked to do here. So what is the
So, yeah,
the action that we would need to do?
I'm unclear as to what our proposed, what it's being asked of us right now, to discuss whether or not we want to review this. Yeah, so what, can staff answer what?
There are two or maybe three separate proposals here. One is to rezone the downtown enterprise zone to this form-based code. The other one is the Laurel Street neighborhood to the form-based code. And then the third question would be, do you want to look at this moving boundary item? So I think you could take action on any three of those tonight in any way that you see appropriate.
Was notice given to the two neighborhoods where okay.
Yes.
So why wasn't notice given to the abutters of 186 Main Street?
Because they may have gotten notice about this zone change anyway, because they're close enough to the downtown enterprise zone, but that's not a specific proposal that's before you tonight to rezone 186 Main Street.
It does say we should consider whether it should be rezoned, that specific property, I guess. This is me on a soapbox now. It's somewhat irksome that I feel like we do have a specific solution that's driven by the very pointed language in what was sent to us, but our hands are tied because.
Right, the council brought up 186 Main Street, and the proposal was whether you wanted to allow these boundary zones to be shifted over one lot. That was the proposal that they asked you to review. So yes, they brought it up under the context of 186 Main Street, but that was not what we were tasked to bring before you to consider.
So they did not ask us to consider and recommend whether 186 Main Street should be rezoned?
No, not directly at this time. No, they did not.
So that feels to me then like if we approve this adjacent, which I don't think we can do tonight because Mr. Sears asked for information, as have I.
Yep.
But if we were to do that, just thinking ahead, then we would assume that we'd soon hear a request from someone to actually make that move.
The 186?
Yeah.
Yes.
So the way zoning works is it can be council initiated or the board can actually initiate it on its own. So we could tonight say, go back to staff and say, we want to initiate a proposed zone change. We want the following information on this so we can decide whether we're going to make a recommendation. So we're not necessarily tied to waiting for, although it was written as though that is specifically what we're asked to look at. If that was not the case, we can still.
Right. Got it. Okay. So we have talked some about action number 2 there. Does anybody have any thoughts about action number 1? Do people feel like they have the information they need to be able to take action on that item?
I'd like to hear if there's public input first, but yes.
Yep. Okay. So any more questions for staff? Okay, great. So,
Actually, one thing. So when I was reading through this, just to kind of wrap my head around what was going on here, it required quite a bit of extra research to go in and look these different zones up and to figure out what they were and what the differences were. And if you could kind of give us the highlights a little bit in the report next time, that would kind of maybe cut down a little bit of some of the back and forth that I had to do just to figure out what was being asked of us.
Yeah, I would concur. I think it's also helpful for the public. We're a little more versed in traversing through Chapter 60, but this is what's made public on the city website with regard to our agenda material, so it can be helpful to the public who are going there to be able to see those comparisons made within the report as well.
I concur with that as well. Okay, if there are no more questions for staff at the moment, I would want to move to the public comment section of this hearing. I'd need a motion.
Make a motion to open public comment?
Second.
All in favor? Okay, if there's any member of the public that wishes to speak to us tonight, please come forward, state your name and what you'd like to tell us.
I take it I'm the only person here from the public.
You are it.
All right. So I own a home in.
So can you name and address, please?
Sure, my name is Al Mandel, and my address is 177 Percy Hill Road in Mine.
Thank you.
I own a property in the Laurel Street neighborhood on Leader Street. So what it sounds like you're doing is you've got a zone, you've got some code that says things must be 25 feet from the road. And since none of the homes are in compliance there, you're moving it to 10 feet to bring it into compliance. Is that correct or incorrect?
It would be 5 feet under the form-based code. Yep.
Okay. So so that would impact, that just actually puts my home into compliance,
It may,
correct?
if that's what, if that's what your particular,
Home in there that's probably 25 feet from the road, right?
correct.
I mean, that's probably why you're proposing this, correct?
It's one of the reasons, yeah.
Okay. So essentially, that would mean no change, simply compliance with code to the bulk of the homes, or at least for me, to my home. Okay. So that's really all you're proposing for a homeowner that is in the Laurel Street neighborhood versus one of these adjacent homes, correct?
There are some other minor differences, but I was just highlighting that is probably the most significant change about moving the multifamily urban into this form-based code.
Okay. No further questions.
Great, thank you.
A motion to close public input?
We have a motion.
Seconded.
All in favor?
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, I just have a point that might be beneficial to the member of the public, if you don't mind.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I just have something to add to one of his questions, if you don't mind, that might be advantageous to them.
Please.
Yeah, so if a structure is considered non-conforming in these zoning districts, if it's damaged or destroyed by more than 50%, it has to be conforming when they rebuild it. So they're not grandfathered in terms of if there was a fire that destroyed 50% of their structure. So if they're now considered conforming, and God forbid there was a tragedy or they wanted to just tear it down and do a rebuild, if they're considered conforming, they can use that same footprint. But they're not going to be able to right now if the ordinance says they have to be 25 feet. So that's just something to consider for if you own homes in that neighborhood, because we get those questions all the time from banks that are asking us to write letters saying that if the house was destroyed by more than 50%, that they could tear it down and rebuild it, and that's not the case. So that's definitely a plus of this as well.
Thank you. Discussion from the board.
Yes, so I was on the board when we actually went through the very lengthy process of developing the form-based code and deciding where to, what areas of the downtown should be zoned form-based. These two areas were identified by the planning board at the time as areas that we highly recommended. However, we did not make it part of our final recommendation to the council. Form-based code was new enough, and we were worried that if we overstepped a reach with regard to geography, that the entire thing might be kind of put to the side. So I'll add to the discussion that these two areas were initially intended to be included in form-based code with these specific designations when we looked at this originally. And I'd like to add to the point that this doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily about bringing a neighborhood into conformance, right? So form-based code is really about identifying what we want a neighborhood to look like. And when you look at these neighborhoods, these look like a traditional downtown New England neighborhood, right? With sort of your large New Englanders up against the road with their stoops. And so the idea of rezoning this is not necessarily to bring these houses into conformance so much as it is to, as staff pointed out, make sure that if something were to happen to one of these properties and it needed to be constructed, that it's reconstructed in a form that fits the neighborhood itself, and that fits the form that we want the neighborhood to look like. In addition, if new houses were to be built, that those new properties also conform to the current neighborhood. If we were to leave these areas in their current zoning, any new property or rebuilt property, completely rebuilt property would stick out like a sore thumb. It wouldn't match the rest of the neighborhood at all. And that's sort of the purpose of the form-based code. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Could I ask a question about that? Was that the only reason that they weren't on there, was because you didn't want to overreach or do too much too fast?
Yeah, specifically when we look at sort of High Street and Pleasant Street, there was a worry so this had come off of just the previous year, a very contentious debate about sort of an aesthetic ordinance, and whether or not, the folks in this area should be required to paint porches, things like that, keep up houses to a specific standard. And that got fairly heated. So we were worried that touching areas like this was going to sort of tap into that previous negativity. And so we chose to leave it out because of things like that.
So how many more areas were also, like, it sounds like there's going to be some more that we're looking at. Was it just these two?
So initially it would have expanded into New Auburn, actually most of the way up the hill, also is what we looked at as well. And we did stop at Minot and Union Bypass. We discussed possibly going further, but it was not part of our initial discussion. But yeah.
But those sound like they're the things that might be coming up in the next.
Yeah, I just put up, it's over off Turner Street.
Makes sense.
So I have a question about the houses that are in there now. If we make this change, how many are we just creating a bunch of other, like, are we just flipping it? So we have houses in there now that comply to the current zone, but then would look out of place under this form-based code. You know what I mean? So
Overall, I would say the change in code will allow the properties to better fit in with current conditions. So if you had that house that had to come down right now and the neighbor's house is 5 or 10 feet off the street, and now you have to build 25 feet back, you've now taken that line, if you will, that building line, and you've created a dent in it, right? Because now that one house is different than all of its neighbors. So you would alleviate some of those concerns, I think. And I would say a vast majority of these will be more in compliance, if you will, under the form-based code than they are now.
okay. And then
I don't have an exact parcel count of how many are going in and out, but
Yep, so if I'm a homeowner and say my house is setback 25 feet, so I'm in compliance with the current zone, and I want to do a remodel but leave one wall, under form-based code, do I then have to comply with the form-based code?
well, it's a minimum and a maximum under the I don't know, I don't
Yeah, I'd
have the
have to
number
look
right in
at the
front of me.
language in form-based code to see what triggers that review, what percentage, I think there's a percentage in there of improvements that you'd be making that would trigger you having to move it closer to the street or landscaping, those sorts of things.
Okay,
But I'll
thank you.
just have to double check, because
Yeah.
yeah, I could be confusing it with floodplain, so I just want to check.
I'd like to give some input on the discussion. Honestly, I think that it's an important question. However, when we consider zoning, the form-based zoning is developed looking at a neighborhood and deciding if the neighborhood looks the way we want it to look, and then sort of trying to preserve that look as we move forward. And that's a little more in line with the way we traditionally do a use-based zoning, is we don't necessarily think about what is there now. It's what do we want to be there in the future. And so I guess I would want to add my own opinion to the discussion that even if there are a few non-conforming houses, if we say that this neighborhood looks the way we want that neighborhood to look, if we impose the form-based code, I would rather have a small handful of properties that are non-conforming that now need to move to fit the aesthetic that we want, rather than to not change it and allow the aesthetic to move farther away from what we're designing for the area.
Yep, thank you.
So, I'm particularly concerned about the houses on Elm Street that are close to Main Street, particularly the Foss Mansion, and I think the house or two across the street from it. I don't know exactly how far back those houses are, but I have a feeling that they might be beyond the maximum setback. And it's, in my opinion, I would not want those houses to not be able to rebuild if they had a lot of problems. I mean, they're historic. They're probably on the Register of Historic Deeds. I don't really know, but I would guess they are. So I would just want to make sure that those houses are protected from any zoning regulations that could hinder their reconstruction if they needed to be.
Is staff able to pull up the language for T42 right now so that we can see the minimum and the maximum? Because right now we're looking at the minimum. But it might be helpful if the maximum is, for instance, 25 feet, well then, right, but it's usually not. If the minimum is 5, the maximum is going to be like 10 or 15, but I think we should know that.
Sure. And can we even bring that information up about those particular parcels? I don't know.
Well, we did create an exception for buildings of historical significance to use
Missed that.
non-conforming uses. So this might be a situation where we now want to say we've identified a problem and we need to develop language for buildings that are of historical significance that fall within the form-based code and develop exceptions for their siting instead of their use. So.
Reading right over it? Did I miss it? Oh, here we go, right? Here we go. So the front is 5 and 15.
5 and 15. Yeah, those houses are certainly farther than 15.
They're definitely farther. I was just looking at the map. They're definitely farther than that.
They almost seem like they would fit in more with, I can't remember the name of T41,
Yeah, the,
downtown neighborhood, is that?
called the
A T41 would actually probably have a
Main Street neighborhood.
closer, a smaller, so it's sort of hierarchical. We use so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So
Okay.
5 being the most, then so like a 4.2 would be minimally less dense than a 4.1.
Okay, I was just looking at the map and thinking of those houses, and they seem like they're about the same setbacks as some of those houses that are in T41. So maybe they are non-conforming. I'm not really sure. 25 feet.
And that's T41?
Yeah, this is 4-1. I brought it up because he mentioned it's 15
Oh.
and 25.
Should go the other direction, should go the other way.
I'll go to 4-2 again.
So are there any provisions for buildings of historical significance in T42? I didn't notice that when I was doing my research.
No, there are none.
Or none, okay.
So you would be looking at wanting to zone the properties on both sides of Elm Street up to High Street as T41, with the remainder being T42?
Sounds about right, yeah. No, that's not on the agenda. Is that something we can even do here?
Well, we can initiate zone changes whenever we want, the process, so. And I apologize, I'm speaking out of turn here, but in the past, if I remember correctly, when we haven't liked something, what we would do is make a recommendation on what was given to us, we would exclude that area, and then we'd make a second recommendation, which is a zoning change that we're initiating, so not initiated by the council, but a planning board initiated zoning change for that separate area that wasn't discussed, which we could certainly do in one meeting tonight. It's not.
Okay, so I guess at this point, we can look at item number 1, and I'll go back to the question I had before. Are people, do people feel like they have enough information to take action on this item?
I feel like I do.
See nodding heads. Okay, great. Does anyone want to take a stab at a motion?
Yes. I'd like to make a motion to recommend expanding the T4.2 traditional downtown neighborhood to the downtown enterprise district and the area adjacent to Academy Elm, Maple, Pleasant High, Drummond, to exclude the lots, excluding the lots on Elm Street from Main Street to High Street, and a portion of Spring Streets, oh, I should have said that after, and the multifamily urban district in the Laurel Avenue and Newberry Street neighborhood based on the findings described in the staff report authored by Justin Poirier and dated November 10, 2020.
Thank you. We have a second.
Second that.
Any discussion of that motion? Okay, all in favor? Thank you. With item 2,
I think we should probably take care of the
Yep.
second piece as well.
okay,
And I'll make a motion, and then we can have the discussion, obviously, after.
Okay.
Sort of waiting for the discussion there, but I would like to initiate a planning board zone change and recommend to the council that they expand the T41, what is its full name? T41,
What do we call it? Traditional Main Street neighborhood.
traditional Main Street neighborhood, to expand it along Elm Street from Main Street to High Street for the parcels on that section of Elm Street.
Second.
Any discussion of that? All in favor?
I like it.
Can we add, and I apologize, this is after, it just occurs to me. Can we add that, if no one has an objection, that our findings for doing so is that the properties on Elm Street from Main Street to High Street represent high-value historical properties that better fit the T401 neighborhood description? Only because I would like to give them context. for
Yep,
that.
no, I think that's correct. I don't have any objections to adding that language?
Sounds great.
No? Okay, thank you. Any more business with item number 1 on this? Hearing none, we'll move to item number 2. We have had a request for more information from Mr. Sear and also from Chairman Duval. Any other discussion, thoughts on item 2? Hearing none, I'll need a motion. And the motion, just keeping in mind, the motion could be to table or, I mean, I think we have to actually do something. We have to table this discussion or,
Should we just make a, I could make a motion to table this to a date certain of our December meeting? Does that work?
works for me.
Pending our receiving more information to clarify Mr. Duval and Mr. Sears' questions.
Second.
Any discussions? All in favor?
Actually, little discussion, sorry. I would like some more clarification on 186 Main Street as well, if that's supposed to be truly in this or not, because it does say that in our staff report here, so if that is truly to be something that we're supposed to consider, I just want more clarification on that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Okay, so you made the motion, right? You seconded it.
Correct.
You approve his? Okay.
Second that.
I guess there's not really. We just have to vote on whether we're going to table this. All in favor? Thanks. Okay. At this time, we'll move to the next item on our agenda, item number 5, review/discussion of planning board policies and procedures. So when we left, we had asked staff to chase down a few things. And I believe you've done some work on that, Megan?
Yes. So at the September meeting, the planning board discussed some items that you wanted to look into in the policies and procedures, whether or not to use Robert's Rules of Order, adding a section to the agenda for the planning board discussion items and concerns, findings of fact, attendance requirements, and that the policies and procedures will be updated every 2 years. So the first, Robert's Rules of Order, let me grab this. I spoke to an attorney at MMA about the use of Robert's Rules of Order for planning board meetings, and he basically said that they were never intended to be used for planning board meetings. They're complex, and they were really created for legal assemblies. He said that they really need to be studied to know how to use and apply them properly to achieve the maximum benefit. Those were his words. So he recommended looking at Gorham's policies and procedures, which is what the MMA planning board manual refers to, and adapt those to how Auburn would like to see meetings run. Unfortunately, when I pulled up Gorham's policies and procedures, they're from 1997, so probably not very useful. And they do refer to Robert's Rules of Order for meeting conduct and procedures, but only if it's not specifically listed in their rules. So if you come across an issue that your policies and procedures don't address, then you would default to Robert's Rules of Order. So I'm thinking that it could be a worthwhile exercise to just kind of thumb through their policies and procedures and see if there's anything in there that the planning board would like to see. The attorney also recommended that for smaller communities like Gorham, they're less likely to have decisions that they make challenged in court. And larger communities like Portland and obviously Auburn, you may want to have some more specific requirements in your policies and procedures that would hold up in a court challenge. So I'm waiting to hear back from Portland just because I wanted to see what they have for their policies and procedures and when those were last updated. The attorney did say that there's really no right or wrong way to run the meeting. It's how the planning board sees it functioning best. So you can certainly pick the items that you like in your current policies and procedures, and then identify items that you'd like more clarification on. The main thing is just to make sure that there's a point of order, that it's consistent among all items that you're reviewing, and that it's something that will hold up in court, that there's a clear process that was used, and the findings are identified, and an attorney could easily thumb through it and say, okay, the planning board followed this process through like they do with all of their projects. So I have this Robert's Rules cheat sheet, and for those of you who have looked through Robert's Rules, it's like 500 pages long. There's a lot to it, and I'm certainly not a professional in how to use Robert's Rules, and I don't know if we have anybody that is. So we're probably not using it to the maximum benefit like he had mentioned. So it's something that we can certainly study more if the planning board wants to adhere strictly to Robert's Rules, or we can go in a different direction.
I think I was the one that brought this up. I generally like the way that we, run our meetings. I don't have any problems with them. I wanted to know what the rules were.
Right.
So it's just,
So, and I would observe that we already use some sort of hybrid of a little bit of Robert's Rules, that's basically making motions. We don't follow the rules of engagement or the rules of speaking really in any way at all. Our policies and procedures state that we are to use Robert's Rules, so if we like how we do things, I think we need to think a little bit about how we describe our discourse at the moment and write that down and make that our policies and procedures. That seems like the way forward to me. Staff, is there any, I guess the question would be back to staff for me if we did that, and I'm just speaking for myself here. Would we want council to look at what we come up with because of the issue you were discussing about needing things to hold up in court?
You certainly can. It's a good question. I want to chat with Eric and see when they developed the policies and procedures originally, if that was something that they ran by city council or if it was just the planning board that went through that process.
I wouldn't necessarily say, I didn't mean city council, I meant actual, the lawyers.
Oh, okay. I apologize, mom brain. Yes, yeah, that's definitely something that we can do, is run it through lawyers and have them look at it and make sure that it's a clear process that would hold up. Yeah, absolutely, we can do that.
Okay. So that would be my thought. I know others probably have thoughts as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are some things that we do that are fairly well, like the casual observer would look like we're following Robert's Rules. for instance, the basic structure of how we make motions. However, we don't utilize subordinate motions. For instance, like when we make a friendly amendment, friendly amendments don't actually exist in Robert's rules. If I wanted to if I wanted to make a friendly amendment, I would make a subordinate amendment. I would make a subordinate motion. So like, I make a motion to amend the current motion to this, right? Which I think would become cumbersome, given the work that we're doing. It's the sort of thing where we're not hammering out like legal minutia, so I don't see us needing to do that a lot. My thought is that it might be in our best interest to go through, look at what parts of Robert's rules we're using, which parts do we use, and say, we are adopting Robert's rules for the following, with regard to the following actions. And if it's going to be motions, clearly identify that, with the exception of subordinate motions, we will follow the following process. And then when it comes to discussion, writing our own process, but having some sort of a hybrid where, because I think, for instance, having motions, I think it would be best to utilize Robert's rules, only because they are, they're in depth, but they're clearly written, right? Maybe I'm being selfish. I don't know if I want to take the time to collectively write the document that's going to describe the totality of our process. So.
Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with your sense of a hybrid description. I think, your example of the motions, I think, are perfect. A friendly amendment, as you say, doesn't exist. Just so people know what the actual Robert's Rules is you make an amendment or you make a motion and somebody says, I would like to amend that motion to X. The whole board votes that up or down. And then if it's accepted, then it goes back to the first motion, the original motion, but in its amended form. If it's rejected, then it goes back to discussion of the motion in its current form. So it's, as Evan suggests, it's quite cumbersome and maybe not useful for us, considering the way in which we do make motions that actually have actions behind them. So the rest of our process is really around discussion, right, and how we talk. Robert's Rules of Order would require that we all speak. You speak, the chair acknowledges, the chair acknowledges you, gives you the floor, and then you can't speak again until everyone else has spoken, etc. I mean, it's much more regimented. And another aspect of it that for me is that it is exclusive. So Mr. Staples, for example, Mr. Staples asked, well, what are the rules? And it's a 500-page book where you have to actually memorize that stuff. So to me, I agree with your suggestion about identifying where we actually use Robert's Rules, and then we can do a brief description of how we run our discussion process.
Yeah, and I think sort of the first thing might be to identify what the major processes are, right? So there's so there are motions that we make, right? There's discussion, right? So rights to speak, rights to make motion. Also under Robert's Rules, like you need the chair to acknowledge you before you can speak. So, you need the chair to acknowledge you in order to be able to make the motion in the first place, right? And then if the chair doesn't acknowledge you, there are processes that you can do to sort of push back against that. And there are all these things. I hope that we would never run into something so contentious that the chair would say, I'm not letting you make a motion, right? So, but if we ditch Robert's Rules for discussion, we sort of develop our own, I don't think they need to be as onerous as Robert's Rules. That's another piece. So then there's motions, but I think that would need to be amended. Something that we almost never do, but does come up very occasionally, is amend the agenda. So that's something else. So I think the best thing to do would be to like be thinking about those things, like what are the things we actually do that we need rules for? Because there are tons of things in Robert's rules that we never do. Like,
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be something that would also be good to ask the lawyers, which ones would be the most important or potentially like actionable, so that we would at least have rules written down for those type of proceedings? And then, because I don't know how often legal action would be taken about our discussion. I'm not familiar, but
Yeah, I
that
think,
would be the more important things. We could have the rules defined for, or use Robert's rules more strictly for those things.
so specifically asking the lawyer before we start, like, what are the things they believe we absolutely need new rules for?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would add that we do have a time where we actually ask questions of people, and so we can describe what the behaviors need to be during question periods, and then also during listening periods.
I
Right.
think we have those in our policy. We do not adhere to those. Like, for instance,
We
tonight
don't.
would be a perfect example. So discussion is meant to be discussion, and someone can ask questions. But it sort of, ours follows similar to the city council, where they can ask questions and the city council can choose to answer them after. And like tonight it worked fine, but then I remember when we were working on the ag zone, as chair, I had to put my foot down and say, I understand you have questions. These are our policies regarding questions. Please read your questions, and we will address those that we think are pertinent to address after. Because people were coming up with questions and questions and questions. It was just too much to.
You
try to
can't
deal
have a
with.
conversation in that instance. Yep. So motions, discussions, questions, item, like behaviors around the agenda, and listening.
One thing we do a lot that we probably need to have a rule for, because if we don't have a rule, I think it could be argued that we treated different individuals differently, is addressing public or applicants out of turn of the section where they are speaking to us, right? Or calling them back for questions and discussion, right? That's something that we tend to do, but we should probably have a rule around that, so that way, if there are 5 people in the room, the 5th person can't say, well, they let the first 4 go up because they were all in favor of this, and there was no process for me to get involved and be able to speak, because.
And I believe, there are a couple ways we could deal with that. One would be just to codify that it's possible to open back up public comment. If we want to talk to somebody, we actually would need to have a motion.
Well, I think we need to call it something other than public comment, because I think, like, earlier you spoke to the idea that, and I think I kind of piggybacked on that comment should be comment, but we do often ask questions, so it is possible for us to ask questions.
Yeah, and I totally hear you. We just need a process that, instead of asking a question and calling them back up to the podium the way we do, we
Yeah.
would actually open a session of interaction that would allow anybody
Yep.
to have that same. Yep. Okay.
So at this point, are we saying, first, is it possible for us to ask legal counsel that question now before we do something? Will they answer it? Because I know sometimes they're kind of touchy about trying to answer things.
Yeah, I
time.
haven't called, obviously, the city attorney. MMA provides a free attorney to municipalities that have questions, and that was the attorney that I spoke to asking about Robert's Rules of Order. But another way that we could go about it is we could pull up a case that was challenged in court and see what those findings were and how that process worked and what information they pulled from the specific review process. And that would give us a good idea of what we'd be looking at if anything was challenged.
Okay. If we are allowed to ask, and this is why I ask, because
Yeah,
legal counsel is funny like that sometimes. Sometimes they'll give you
right,
lots of answers, and sometimes they'll say, I don't want to look at this till you give me a final product.
right.
Yeah, upon reflection, that it was a pretty broad request to ask them to find anything that would be applicable to our meetings.
Would it be possible, I know you've already spoken to the MMA attorney, to call and just ask the question for us? You know, saying that the planning board is thinking about developing a hybrid system, but they're really trying to identify those things that require rules. Can you give any feedback on those things that there should really be rules written about?
I would
To
actually,
to answer Riley's question.
yeah, I mean, I would hope that an MMA attorney would be a good person to ask that question of, because they should know what typically gets challenged, right? Because they would theoretically speak with lots of people about such cases.
Well, can we add that to the question? I don't want to add more work, Megan, but can we add that to the question? You know,
I mean,
asking specifically,
that's-
what are those things that get challenged most often?
Yeah, that's the question I heard from Mr. Bergeron. So maybe I'm just mishearing what Mr. Bergeron is saying, but yes, I would love to hear the answer to that question.
I'll do that. It'll either be the free attorney, or if Eric thinks that we should contact the city attorney who
Yeah.
deals with city projects, then we can go through them as well. Sorry.
Okay, so anybody have anything else they want to add to our discussion of how we have our discussions?
Covered it.
No? Excellent. So the next item on your list was attendance policy, is that correct?
Discussion items or concerns.
Sorry, one more time? Oh, you mean the, on the agenda?
Yeah,
I think we've actually made that change already.
okay, all right. I had that, and then I had findings, attendance, and updating every 2 years.
The reason the items for discussion and concerns came up is because we need to update the planning board policy to include that. So the planning board policy
Right.
actually outlines what can be in the agenda, and it didn't include that.
Okay,
So it's not that we need to discuss whether we want that. I think we all want it. It just needs to like make it as an item in
Okay.
the actual policy itself.
And then your next one after that was findings?
correct, yep. So when we did those, or Mr. Sear was just talking about these before the planning board meeting, we were doing those pre-planning board meeting discussions, and one of the items that we had talked about were findings. And we started having all of the planning board members sign the findings of fact. And then we had discussed, hey, maybe we should put something in the policies and procedures that just the chair signs it and have that identified. So the format that I used in another community, I kind of carried it over because I like how it describes everything. What we usually do is we provide a letter of approval to the applicant, and it doesn't list the exhibits, it just lists that the planning board approved your application, these were the findings, and these were any conditions. The findings of fact is something that the planning board would sign, and it would go in the file for the project so that you can clearly identify the process. So it has a description, and then it goes through the planning board's review process. For example, the planning board had their public hearing, reviewed the project on this day. They tabled it, considered it again on this day, added these conditions. So someone could go back and easily look at the tape for those meetings as well if they wanted to, or pull up the minutes. And then it gets into the reference plans and documents. So this is, it's a lot of work for staff to have to go through every single individual piece of paper and describe them, but I think it's important to list out what the planning board actually considered in their review process. So what were the plans that the planning board actually had in front of them that they looked at and approved? Because that's certainly something that could get challenged down the road if it was amended and it was something that the planning board didn't actually review. And then, of course, it goes through this one was a subdivision, so it'll go through the subdivision guidelines. Others would go through special exception guidelines. And then it lists the motion, how many were in favor, against, abstained, and then it has the conditions. And what we did in the other community was we had everybody on the planning board sign it that voted on that item, but it's something that can certainly be signed by just the chair as well. So this is just an example of a findings of fact format that kind of goes through your review and approval process. And so it's something that we could continue with, or we could formalize it in the policies and procedures. So kind of just looking for feedback from the board on where you'd like to see your findings process go.
Thank you. Comments, thoughts from the board?
Of course I have comments.
Well, that's why I'm looking at you.
Yeah. So I have two things, I guess three. One, I think it's important enough that we should include it. Findings were always included in staff reports for years and years and years, and there was a period of time then where it wasn't. But Megan switched over to doing findings on a separate piece of paper like this that was signed. But when they were part of the staff report, and I mean, I did it tonight, you know, based on the findings described in the staff report, whatever, because it's important that we use findings of fact to justify our decision always. That's how you avoid, you know, losing a legal challenge, right? So I think it's important enough that we should somehow codify this in our policy that all decisions will be, something as simple as like all decisions will be accompanied by findings of fact, right? My second piece being, I see no reason why the entire board has to sign it. The chair signs the final plans at City Hall, and I think it would be convenient to have the plans and the findings of fact at the desk, so whoever the chair is can walk in and sign them there. I think it's more expedient for staff as well. It doesn't require the staff bring them here and then track everyone down who was there to vote. Because if your name is there and you voted, you've got to sign it, right? So I think that helps avoid that. And then my last piece is specifically to Megan. The exhibits. So do you think it would be enough to identify just the application? Because I see as I was looking through, so I'm looking through and I'm seeing right, okay, so I'm looking through and I'm seeing, okay, so like the USGS location, tax map, cover letter regarding the apartment subdivision. Those things are all part of the application.
Right.
Right?
So a lot of times we get binders like this.
Right.
That have all that information bound together. Sometimes you'll get your packets where they're just paper clipped together. So if those ever got separated in the file, that's why I list them all out, but I can certainly just...
No, I guess it doesn't matter to me. I'm trying to think
Yeah.
of what, I think it's important. I think you're right.
Yeah, it is a process.
If you think it is important to do this, I mean, I'm certainly fine to let staff do that, but I would be fine with,
Okay.
Yeah, so I have a question to Mr. Sears' point. I think, are all of these things posted, are all of the exhibits packaged together in a PDF on the webpage for our meeting?
We have them on our shared drive for each meeting. So for example, I think I might still have it up. This is the shared drive for this meeting. So it's got all of the items that you received paper copies of.
But yeah, I guess my question is for the public, because the packet gets posted for the public, right?
Right, we haven't posted the findings for the public, but we certainly can.
Not the findings, but the
But
materials
the
that we're going to be looking at.
materials, yeah. So if the materials are all
The exhibits.
bundled in a PDF for a
Oh, I
given,
see what you're saying.
then
Yeah.
you can refer to
Right.
that document rather than the whole thing, because it will have a date.
In addition, I think if it's not something that was available to the public, it
Then
shouldn't
it
be an
should get
exhibit
listed.
Right,
Yeah,
unless we formally accept it during the meeting, at which time you'd add it as an additional exhibit, but.
yes. I agree completely. That will just save you time.
right. Yeah, definitely. No, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Any other thoughts, comments on findings?
I guess the only other comment I have, if you don't mind, is just the planning board doesn't usually make a yes or no, we all agree on each of these findings specifically. You go through them and say, we agree that it meets the findings in the staff report. In other communities, it was a process and took a lot longer, but they went through each one individually, like has sufficient water available for the reasonably foreseeable needs of the subdivision. I agree, I disagree. And then there was discussion about why we disagree. And then we would put that discussion underneath each of these so that it's clearly listed what the planning board talked about under each of those findings. Again, it's a huge additional process, but it's just making it more clear. So it's something to consider.
So if somebody were to do that, so say I disagree with item number 9. So it would say, Mr. Staples disagrees with item number 9. I would still vote yes on the entire thing, but it would be noted that I disagreed with one part of it? Or did they, if somebody disagreed with something, did they have to vote no on the whole project plan?
Yeah, you wouldn't have to vote no on the whole project, but it would be noted that what the discussion was or why there was disagreement. But if the entire board was in favor, or not the entire board, I apologize, if a majority of the board was in favor of it, then it would carry through. But if a majority didn't agree with number 9, then the project shouldn't be approved because you have to approve it that it meets those criteria.
To Mr. Stable's point, I understand what you're saying. It would concern me to have a lawyer look at the document and say, Mr. Staples and Mr. Sear made a strong case for why they believed that this criteria was not met. Yet, in the final vote, they voted to approve, which requires that they believe all of the criteria are met. So like when we vote, the way the language is written is that like, this subdivision meets all of these criteria. If there's one thing that we think it doesn't meet, then we have two choices. We deny that application, the applicant, their application, or we can table and ask them to seek a solution, or we can develop a solution for them, whether they like it or not, right? But I would be, I don't know, it's just me, I'd be concerned.
Hey,
Well, if a majority of the board doesn't agree with one of the findings, you shouldn't approve it anyways.
I guess I would be concerned that a lawyer would look and say, oh, well, these two individuals say, did not agree with the entirety of the findings, but then voted to approve,
Right.
which would require that we do agree with the entirety of the findings.
And it does happen. It's not specifically listed in the findings, but there is discussion at the planning board meetings. Some people may not feel that the stormwater is adequately handled because this abutter is upset that the water's going onto his property. So that discussion happens. If someone were to pull up the tape, it's not written down in the findings of fact.
yeah, but I think the issue that I hear Mr. Sear making is that there's not then codified in the findings of fact an agreement and then, or a disagreement followed by an agreement,
Right.
right? It's a discussion, and then at the end you vote and you up or down the whole project,
Right.
right? So to me, the bit by bit, while very thorough, also allows people to move to innocence on certain issues, right? So if you have a you have some, thing that you really care about. And maybe it's, landscaping. Trees have to be a certain amount of height, or it's never done correctly or something. You can approve all the projects, yet also shine through as being the person who always objects to that particular thing,
Right.
which is not,
Right, the idea is
helpful.
that if you have a serious if you have an objection
then
to
you
one of the
object.
criteria in the findings, you object. That is the way our ordinance is written such that, like, if you find that one of these is not, and you're right, we have discussions, but then ultimately it's up to each individual to decide after having the discussion, okay, I had that concern, and now it's been addressed, or it hasn't, and now I'm gonna vote no.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, we did that recently, within the last few months, maybe it's coming again, maybe within the last year.
Yeah, well, I
something where
mean,
there's
I can
the-
think of one particularly contentious thing where I thought it was fairly close to a bunch of people saying no. I mean,
Right.
And if I remember correctly, though, like, didn't we either made some kind of, we made some change, or we tabled it, or I cannot remember specifically what happened, but,
yeah, I think we selected a solution for them,
right.
of your three options, which is approve, table it, or make a solution for them. I think we chose the latter.
Another example would be, for instance, the EL building.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about, actually.
What?
That's the one I was thinking about before.
Right, and where I know I was sounding nitpicky about the screening, but it said that it's a finding we've got to make, right? And so I was like, hey, I don't want this to be something that is a legal challenge later. And so the solution was there was essentially that the findings said that, the fact of findings stated that, that adequate landscaping is there to provide for aesthetics. I'm going to paraphrase it, but that was the intent of what it said.
Right.
And our finding was that it did meet this because it didn't need landscaping for the aesthetics, and it was more advantageous to actually have no landscaping there, right? So I think we address these things. I just
Yeah,
don't
so-
want to address each of them individually in a
Right.
discussion like that.
Yeah, so I think I agree, and I come back to thinking that this is a good idea and that we should do this. I think at this point, that's probably something we'd want to vote on to add to the procedures, if we want to reify this within the procedures. And I think we would also want to vote on the chair being that it being adequate that just the chair is signatory on that. So if somebody wants to make a motion on either of those, I'll entertain those.
Well, we don't have any policy statement that says the whole board has to sign the fact of findings to begin with, right? So,
I think there's something in the ordinance, if I recall, that requires the entire planning board to sign. It's either the approval document or the plan. There's something in the ordinance that requires the entire board to sign.
well, it can't be the plan because that's always been the planning board, but the chair.
The chair, right.
Well, in that case, I guess I would want to defer any kind of action until every,
Yeah, I would agree. If there's something in the ordinance, I'd want to know what that was before we set up a policy against that. What about actually having, does that mean that people would not like to vote on whether or not we want to codify this practice in our rules and procedures?
I guess, so this is where I'm at. I don't know how everyone else feels. And I don't want to delay the process anymore. I would feel really good if I came in next meeting and there was an actual item 1 that you wanted to vote on, right? So like this is item, 3 or 4? This is the format that was presented, and give the format a name so that I have that format in front of me. and then we can make a motion to adopt format blank whatever in the staff report dated whatever as the way we're gonna do it. You know, we're gonna, we're gonna
So
vote to.
you want an example to vote on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Vote, with regard to planning board items for discussion. What that agenda page looks like in the policy, in the planning board bylaws and policies. So that way, I can sit there and make a motion to include item number, whatever, into the policies and procedures.
Yep.
I don't know how everyone else feels. I guess I'm worried, I'm sitting here thinking like, well, I guess I could make a motion, but I'm not sure exactly what the specific outcome would be.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really good reminder of how processes should work, is that we should have a changed, we do it with ordinance, right? If we're going to change an ordinance or change language, we have the cross-out, the strikeout version of that. So I think we should, it feels like next time having a strikeout version where we can actually vote on specific parts of it as we go through would be the right thing.
And, I'd say to Megan and to city staff, I mean, you presented this, and that's the way we get those ordinance documents, right? Staff comes to us with what staff believes would be a good answer. And I know it's hard because you're making a determination about our policies, right? But I think there was enough discussion tonight to say that, yeah, we like that. So, if you put that in there, no one's gonna, we might find specific things that we want changed, but it's not gonna be a big deal to do that. So, like, the remainder of the discussion might be fruitful to sort of give Megan direction on like we'd like to see what that might look like, or like, like clearly we were like, yeah, no, we don't want to see discussion for each, fact.
Yep.
Finding, but.
Yep. That's great, thank you. The next item on your list was attendance, is that correct?
Right, yeah, the current policy requires that it doesn't drop below 50% within a 12-month period. If it does, the chairperson can forward a recommendation to city council to remove the member from the board. So,
Okay. Any thoughts about, there was some discussion of this last time. Anybody have any thoughts on that policy in particular, or whether or not it should change?
Well, I know we discussed that I think what we ought to do is codify both attendance policies together in the same document. So additionally, somewhere else is written that you can't have 3 unexcused absences, right? So if you are, your third unexcused absence triggers this process as well. But it's not written there, right? So so first I would say those 2 things need to be written together with a definition of what sort of an excused absence would be. I guess part of my, in my world, that's what we'd call it, right? It's like an excused absence, right? So that would be my first thing. The last meeting, I know some people thought that 50% was really high, to kind of wait for 50%. My personal opinion, I feel like if it's something that's sort of excused, if it's something that the board has previously deemed is okay to miss a meeting for, I'm fine with leaving it 50, and my preference would be that, the chair, if it's really getting up to that point, the chair would sort of like talk to someone and say, we really appreciate your service, but is this something you still want to do? And like, don't feel bad if you can't do it anymore, right? Rather than go through the process of sending them to the council for removal.
Right, oh, yeah.
So I have no problem with 50%, but.
I think, as far as I'm concerned, it seems like this should be something that it's above us. This should be something that is consistent amongst all boards and committees in the city. Maybe not school committee and city council, but there's a lot of other boards, and I think every single one of them has a different policy. Did you guys talk about this at all in the board on boards and committees, is that what they called it?
No, the mayor's ad hoc, we didn't, but I think that was actually probably a miss. I think that would have been a good one to talk about, and I might shoot Jason an email about that, Jason and Phil an email about that, because I think that's not a bad suggestion, actually. But to Mr. Sears' point, we need to understand what an excused absence is as part of that.
You said, like, at school, is like a list of things that count as an excused absence? Is that would be something we'd have to come up with? Like,
Well, you know, when we were in school, there was a list. This is 2020. If mom calls and says you're not coming to school, it's excused, So we could go that lax, but the idea is like, yeah, it's not, there used to be a list. but Now it's very much like all right.
Yeah, I mean, I recall when I signed up for this that it was, if you were in town, you could only miss twice if you were in town, and then it was no good. So in 12 months. So I don't know where I heard that because I've never seen it written, but
No, that is somewhere, and I forget where it is, but it is written somewhere. But but also, and I don't know, at this point, I'm not confident it was written down, but the rule was always that if you contacted staff or the chair ahead of time,
like 24 hours or
that would
something,
be
yeah.
considered excused. Like, unexcused was like, we thought you were gonna be here, and you weren't.
Yep.
So the idea behind it is not to compel the idea behind the policy was not about compelling members to be here. It was about allowing the chair and staff to prepare to make sure that there would be quorum for the board to do business.
Yep.
Right? So like there was a totally different purpose, like it was written for two different,
Yeah.
you know, it was like a different.
Yeah, I think finding that place where that other thing is written down would be good. I've looked for it. I don't
I'm
know
with
where
you.
it is.
I've seen it. I was told the same thing.
I mean, Megan and I had a conversation this summer, and you thought it was, that rang true to you too. and
Right.
you
Yeah,
couldn't
I don't
find
know
it.
where I saw it, but I'm gonna search for it.
Yeah.
The ordinance has a lot of those things where stuff is in random places and doesn't necessarily match up always.
So it may be in the ordinance.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so my feeling on what I heard on that is a suggestion to ask whether or not there is a common across the city policy on this, and whether or not that's actually a good idea.
I don't know how everyone else feels. Yeah, I'd be willing at this point to say our action on this is actually to ask you to speak to the mayor and the city manager and express, sounds like everyone's sort of on board, express the board opinion that this would be a good idea and that we would defer our decision on this to hear about whether they plan on adopting a citywide attendance policy. I don't know how, it sounds like that's kind of where everyone's at.
I think, for me, it's arbitrary, like, how many absences. For me, the whole point of having an attendance policy in the first place is so that a board can meet, and we've been successful in that, so I think it's working. You know, we have quorum. The other part would be so that there's enough people on the board that are present that can contribute to lead to a meaningful discussion. I think that's kind of arbitrary. How do you decide that? I don't know.
Well, I think quorum, like you just gotta go with,
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
go with
but
quorum, right? Like,
I mean, to Mr. Sears' point that he made earlier, that it's for planning, and for a bit tonight, it looked like a near thing that we were just going to be barely at quorum unexpectedly, and we expected to have one additional person than we currently have now. So for planning purposes, I think it is really useful to have some policy.
and yeah, again, I think that's really that was really the impetus behind having it, right? I mean, it was not so much to compel members to be here as much as it is to be able to make sure that,
To know whether or not we can actually meet.
yeah.
Yep. Okay, and because my memory's failing me, I had your final item on your list. Oh, sorry, Mr. Sear, you had suggested an action. Are people in agreement with that action?
I'm in agreement.
Would you
with-
feel more comfortable if I made a motion?
No, I'm happy. I just didn't look around the room to see nodding heads. I was writing actually that action down, so.
No, I'm saying, I'm asking that because then it would make it like very clear or whatever, but
Sure, make a
at this
motion.
point, you can ask for a straw poll. I mean, that would be reasonable because it's not like sort of an adjudicatory
Okay,
action.
so all in favor? All right, thank you. The last item on your list, Megan, that I remember, I wrote down update, and I don't know what that is.
We just had down that the planning board wanted the policies and procedures updated every 2 years.
Got it.
So just something to throw in there.
Again, I think that would be an item that would go into a new version, and then something that we could vote on.
Yeah, and again, yeah, I'd like to see like the language in the policy so
Exactly.
that we can vote on that.
Yep.
I don't know how everyone feels about it. I don't know if I want to say updated. I think like,
I think reviewed
Right, I
and
know, I was gonna get
revised as
really-
needed, yeah.
yeah, I was going to get really, really specific there, but like I think reviewed.
Reviewed and updated as needed, I think
Yeah.
would be the type of language we would want. With that, I think that brings us a close to item number 5, a review and discussion of planning board policies and procedures. The next item is number 6, public comment. I don't see any members of the public present. We'll move on to item 7, planning board items for discussion. Does anybody have anything they would like to share with the board?
The comp plan review committee is scheduled to meet November 19th. So that's a Thursday. And you had mentioned earlier that we needed to
Get to
do
that.
something. But that was all my update.
So what was it, November 19th, you said?
Thursday, yep.
Thursday. And then it will meet bi-weekly? So every 2 weeks?
That was the proposal.
Yep. Okay. Any other items for discussion? Comment? Okay, so I do have one, as Mr. Staples was suggesting. The mayor has requested that we select an alternate for the comp plan committee. Our 2 members right now are Mr. Staples and Mr. Martelli. Mr. Martelli is going to be absent from us for a little while, being Santa Claus. And as a result, we probably should have another member sit on those meetings. I'll ask for volunteers. I'll note that I'm happy to do it if no one else cares to throw their name in the ring. But would anybody else like to sit on the comp plan update? It's actually pretty interesting.
How long is the alternate expected to serve? I.e., how long is Mr. Martelli expected to be gone?
For December.
I don't know. I would assume it would be the commitment through end of summer. But I think if you're an alternate,
No, I understand the commitment will be through end of summer, but the reality is whoever is throwing their name in for alternate is looking at being present at least in the near future, right?
yes,
So,
Definitely.
is
at least through the end of the year, the end of this calendar year, for sure.
spill over into January at all?
You mean where you really need to be there because the other person wouldn't
Right.
be? I have no idea.
And Mr. Staples, are the meetings planned to be on Thursdays?
We were supposed to discuss that and come to an agreeable time, but we haven't.
So there is no specific day of the week decided yet?
No, that was just what Eric threw out there as a potential first date.
And the first date is,
November 19th. It's
then
the
you'd be
Thursday.
meeting bi-weekly, so you'd be looking at whoever does this, we're probably looking at 3 to 4, because assuming that Mr. Martelli's not going to be back right at the new year.
Yeah, I would think it's at least.
At least
three or
2, at least
At
maybe
least,
3.
oh, definitely 2, probably, I would say definitely 3, perhaps 4.
I say that just in case, I'm not putting my name in, I'm just sure everyone knows what the commitment is. Yeah.
No, that's very helpful, Mr. Hitter, thank you. Anyone else interested in doing this work? No?
In that case, I nominate Matthew Duval as an alternate planning board member to the comp plan review committee.
Thank you, I accept that nomination. All in
Second
favor?
that nomination?
I don't know whether you second nominations.
I don't, again, not that familiar with the rules.
Oh, yeah, I guess, well, I would nominate you, well, so there'd be a nomination, and then I guess the way council does it is, these are the nominees, and then then there needs to be a motion. So now I make a motion to appoint Mr. Duval as the alternate member to the Comprehensive Plan Review Committee. Then we would go with a second.
Thank you. Do we have a second? We got a second. All in favor? Great.
See what I mean about like ridiculous processes, right? We want to avoid that.
We probably
Yeah.
still messed that one up too.
Well, it's another one of the things we do, right? It's voting
Yeah.
in elections.
So that is something that you're just going to be doing through the end of Mr. Martelli's commitment?
I think that remains to be seen, whether or not the little committee actually wants me to continue to show up or not.
Fair enough.
But I'll certainly do it for the next couple of weeks. I can do that. Item number 8, miscellaneous. Upcoming items for December.
So the December meeting is going to have to be virtual on Zoom because for the form-based code, the districts that we're notifying, there were 611 notices that went out. And due to the number of people that we're allowed to have and the COVID regulations, we can't have that many people here at City Hall if all of them showed up for whatever reason, or even if half of them showed up, or a quarter of them. So it has to be virtual on Zoom.
For which
Wasn't
Zoom?
there something that we could meet in person and they could be virtual on screen?
Yep, that's possible too. That's a possibility. There's some component of it is going to be on Zoom. So it's either the entire planning board's going to be on Zoom or the public's going to be on Zoom. I think that's what the city council's been doing. So we'll send you some more information on how all of that's going to work, but there will be some Zoom component to that meeting.
So, I apologize for interrupting. There is going to be a major zoning change amendment come in front of us? Is this what you're saying?
Correct. The other items that Justin was talking about for the form-based code. Districts.
Being,
That area around Turner Street that
Right.
you hadn't included the first time, right? You had mentioned you hadn't included
Okay.
New Auburn too, is that? already-
Correct. Yeah.
And they're
611 notice parcels went out.
okay, so they're expecting much more turnout than
Yeah.
obviously tonight.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many went out tonight, but certainly not as many. We have a solar project in the ag zone out on Perkins Ridge Road that you will see. And there's a change that the city council is working through right now to the home occupation marijuana standards. Right now, it has a 25% of the residential home cap on the amount of area that you could use for cultivation, but there's no maximum square footage on that. So depending on the size of your home, you could have a pretty large cultivation area that really goes beyond what the home occupation standards are intended to achieve. So city council is recommending it be capped at 500 square feet. So 25% of your floor area or 500 square feet. So you'll see that next month. And that's all we have so far. The deadline's up, so we shouldn't have any more proposals for December.
Okay, great, thank you. Here we have reached item number 9, adjournment.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? Thank you all.